The real enemy at work under all of Genesis through Kings is the snake and his minions.
Genesis 6 describes the second supernatural rebellion. Some of the sons of God, members of the heavenly council, transgress the boundary between heaven and earth.
The seed of the woman
Yeah.
and the seed of the snake.
Yeah.
You're like, huh? Okay. There's going to be perpetual hostility between these two seeds, these two lineages.
These two powers.
Yeah, these two powers. And ultimately, a seed will come from the woman that will crush the head of the snake.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells, where we're rediscovering the Bible on its own terms. And we found the supernatural focus of the Bible has been suppressed, and we're bringing that out into the light so that we can see the good news about what Jesus has done for this world. As always, I just want to take a second and ask you to subscribe. It means so much for this channel for you to take a quick second. Please like, please share, please subscribe. It helps us so much get the good news out about what Jesus has done for this world.
As we started this conversation, you set the stage to kind of say, look, the way the Bible begins is in a garden.
Yes.
And where people actually thrive is amongst trees and water and kind of garden settings.
Yeah, exactly. Because the first thing that is not good in all of God's good world, 7 times God pronounces it good after creating the sky and the land and the sea, is a human alone. Because a human alone can't accomplish the human vocation, which is to multiply and to steward and have responsibility over creation. So God splits the human, and the woman that is the delivering ally for the lone human, she is called the Ezer, which means delivering ally. So God takes the human, puts the human in the garden, gives them a command. Okay?
Yeah.
So, next thing, Yahweh Elohim said, it's not good. This is the first thing that is not good. On the 7 days, it was good, 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 very good. It's the first thing, not good. It's not good for the human to be alone.
Because there's just one human.
There's just the human. Ha'adam. The human. I will make and the Hebrew word here is Ezer, for him. It's usually translated with the word helper, or King James help meet. I recently came across what is now my favorite translation. Thank you, Dr. Carmen Imes, Hebrew Bible professor down at Biola now, University. She has the translation ally, which is perfect.
An ally.
Ally. And I've modified it slightly to delivering ally. Because in Ezer is always, well, actually the main one it describes in the Hebrew Bible every time this word appears is God. And specifically when God comes to rescue Israel. Actually, we saw it in Psalm 46 in the previous conversation.
Yep.
God is the help for his people or for his city when the world's falling apart.
Yeah.
So if you have the idea of like assistant helper or helper to the assistant, like this is not, it means the only one who can provide the deliverance that is needed to provide safety or accomplish the mission. So that's why
this is like making a treaty with a neighboring king who can come and protect and rescue you.
Or even more, that they have the river in their land.
Yeah.
And we have like the flat, fertile farm fields.
Yeah.
And so let's become each other's Ezer. So I can grow the wheat, but you have to send the water to me.
I see.
And we need...
We're allies.
We're allies. It's a perfect word.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carmen. So I will make a delivering ally for him.
But delivering because, why are you adding the word delivering?
I'm adding the word delivering because what it means is there's something wrong. There's some challenge, obstacle.
Without the ally, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble. And so this relates to, what do I know about the job given to ha-adam. From the 7-day narrative, it is to rule as male and female that together are the image, and to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, and subdue.
Yeah, and that calling cannot be fulfilled with the lone human. So I'll make the delivering ally. So you get the scene of Yahweh forming creatures from the ground, bringing them to the humans to see what the human would call them. And the human calls the names of the creatures, but for the human there was not found in Ezer. So now we have a whole narrative where God takes the human on a journey so that the human begins to see what the human needs. Like the human begins to realize that the human doesn't have an Ezer. Because here's those creatures, and well, that's not like me. I can't work with that. That can't be an ally to me. At least I think that's what's going on.
Yeah.
So God causes a sleep, actually not just any sleep, but trance, visionary, altered consciousness sleep. That's what tardema means. And he slept. And he, that is Yahweh, took one from his sides, or one of his sides. He closed the flesh in his place. Here's the key word. And Yahweh built the side, which he took from the human into woman. And then he brought her to the human, and the human sings a little song of rejoicing.
And famously, this has been translated as rib.
Ah, correct.
Took one of his ribs.
Yeah.
But the word, and we've talked about this before, the word in Hebrew literally means a side.
Yeah, it describes, Selah describes the side of a building, the side of a box, like the Ark of the Covenant, or the side of a hill. Yeah.
Okay.
So he
takes
one of his sides.
Yeah. And then, you've described this as splitting him in two, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. My point is the imagery is very suggestive, and I think that we're being invited to see many layers of meaning. So the fact that...
And when I say him, you've also kind of made a point of saying ha-adam was not gendered in a way, in the narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a default in that ha-adam is a masculine noun, but it also is the generic title for species. And the first time ha-adam, the human, is used in the 7-day creation narrative, it explicitly is the species name for male and female. This is in Genesis 1:27. God created ha-adam.
And here you get this picture of someone who split in half becomes male and female.
Yeah. So whether the default beginning state is male and then out of male comes woman, that's a legitimate inference of the narrative. But I do want to at least be aware that male default is not the emphasis of the story, because ha-adam is generic, can refer to the species or to a human male. And then the words man and woman that are specifically gender words or biological sex words don't appear till after the splitting.
Okay.
So I just feel like it has to be significant.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
So you made a point of saying when Yahweh takes the side, Yahweh builds the side.
Yes. So this word build, it's curious. Here, we'll just do a real-time situation here. This is Genesis 2, 19? So New American Standard has fashioned. So kind of make the word feel less awkward.
Like crafted or something.
Yeah. So 375 occurrences in the Hebrew Bible. So Noah is going to build an altar. That's the word bana. Nimrod is going to build Nineveh. Abraham builds an altar. Actually, in the book of Genesis, the two things that get built are cities or altars.
What's Genesis 30?
Oh, actually, well, that's a really interesting one.
Weird.
Yeah, it actually makes sense, but it's a deep rabbit hole.
Okay, we'll skip it.
Exodus 1, the Israelites are building cities for Pharaoh. Moses builds an altar. Notice this is basically it.
Yeah.
Altars and cities.
Altars and cities, okay.
So it's builds the side of ha'adam, into a woman. That's weird. It's a weird thing to say in Hebrew. It's supposed to catch your attention, like...
It's supposed to make you think, like, is this an altar or is this a city?
Yeah. What you build are constructed items. And the only two things, built in the Torah.
Because when he formed man out of the dirt...
Yes, it was a word for molding.
Molding.
Yatsar, which is what's used to describe what a potter does with clay. So this is more of a construction word. So, and this is very common in the Hebrew Bible. The biblical authors will use intentionally awkward, strange feeling turns of phrase.
This is awkward in Hebrew.
It's awkward in Hebrew to get your attention. That they're either...
There's an idea behind it.
There's an idea that they're either hyperlinking back to, or in this case, I think foundationally, like establishing an idea that's going to become important in what follows. So my point here is just to say, here's a human in a place of vulnerability and with an obstacle. They can't do what God has called the human to do. So God provides an Ezer, a delivering ally, by building it for the vulnerable human. God builds the delivering help in the form of a woman. That's the foundational image in this little scene. And those aren't details you would necessarily know to pay attention to. But as we're going to see, the little thing I just said is just going to keep coming up over and over and over again, but in really creative twists.
And the thing that you said is that he builds a woman?
You have somebody who's in a desperate situation. They can't get themselves out of it.
Got it.
And so God provides a delivering ally, an Ezer. And God provides it by building it. Multiple puzzles at work in the snake. One thing to clarify, the snake is not called the Satan in that story.
Right.
That's a title that's going to come to be associated with this arch rebel, spiritual rebel, later on in the Hebrew Bible. So we'll just call it the snake.
Okay.
So there's two options. One is that the snake had its own rebellion, and that story is not narrated in Genesis, but it's presumed, and then you get the backstory later on in the Bible. Another possibility is that Genesis 3 is telling you the rebellion story of the snake and the human simultaneously.
That is his rebellion.
That it's the fall of the snake and the fall of Adam and Eve in the same story. And I actually think that's there's some textual details that point in that direction. For example, the snake is introduced as a beast of the field, and it's arum in Hebrew.
Crafty?
Well, it gets translated crafty, but if you do a word search on arum in the Hebrew Bible, it's like under 10 other occurrences, and it's always a positive trait of being smart and shrewd, is sometimes perceptive.
Yeah. It's not far from the word for wisdom.
Correct. In other words, it's used a lot in the book of Proverbs, and it's a positive trait to be arum.
Yeah.
So the snake is introduced in the first sentence with a positive wisdom trait. It's a perceptive, clever creature. And what's interesting, that's he's said arum mikol habehemot, crafty more than all the beasts of the field. What he ends up is being arur mikol habehemot, cursed more than all the beasts of the field. So within the course of the narrative, he goes from being arum to arur, more than all the beasts. And I think that's it's a literary design.
It's his Breaking Bad.
Yes, yeah, totally. He's a good creature gone bad.
Yeah.
So this presumes what is the creature. In the video, we draw a whole bunch of design patterns from all over the Hebrew Bible that point in the direction of that snake being a spiritual being in disguise, namely one of the cherubim seraphim.
Yeah, so if the garden was a place where all of God's creatures lived, where the humans were meant to rule,
correct,
then it wouldn't be strange to have one of the cleverest creatures there. All the creatures are there.
Yeah, the cherubim are there. We meet them at the end of chapter 3.
We know they're guarding.
So Adam and Eve are hanging out with
creatures.
With heavenly creatures that surround the divine throne.
And earthly creatures.
That's
the picture you get. Heavenly creatures, earthly creatures, overlapping, God's space, our space together. That's the garden. So from that perspective, God isn't like, I know this guy's trouble, but I'm going to let him in.
Yeah.
It's like, no, he's just part of God's good creation.
Yeah, and so this is key, because sometimes the Satan figure is talked about as if he is essential evil and has always been so.
Okay.
So the story portrays him as a fallen creature, just like the humans are going to be fallen creatures.
Yeah.
He's a rebel.
Eden was the home and headquarters of God. His supernatural and earthly families resided there. God wanted them to image him in their own ways. Heaven and earth blended together into one family, but one family member didn't like that idea.
We've all heard about the serpent in Eden, but why a serpent? What's that supposed to tell us? Ancient people knew how to take this scene, but we don't. We assume the serpent is merely an animal. His form is important, but the story is not about zoology. The story is about a supernatural rebellion. Isaiah alludes to that rebellion.
I will raise up my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mountain of assembly. I will make myself like the Most High.
Isaiah is talking about the sons of God in the assembly. Just like Job, he refers to them as stars. They were present before Eden. Ezekiel 28 mentions the rebellion in Eden as well. In Ezekiel's case, a guardian cherub gets kicked out of Eden.
You were an anointed guardian cherub, and I placed you on God's holy mountain. You walked in the midst of stones of fire.
Ancient Mesopotamian tablets talk about cherub throne guardians and describe them as snakes and dragons. The serpent of Eden was actually a supernatural being whose job was to guard God's throne. An ancient person would have known the scene was about a rebel in the divine council.
So they're exiled from Eden. They have children, Cain and Abel. And then we watched how Cain replays his parents' failure and folly, not with a tree, but with a brother.
Mm-hmm.
And he murders his brother. And so God does to Cain what he did to Adam and Eve, which is exile them to the east. And so Cain is freaked out.
Yeah, he's now like wandering in the east.
Mm-hmm.
He is worried that someone's gonna avenge.
Yeah, whoever finds me will kill me. Not an unwarranted concern. And so what Yahweh...
And what's interesting is how you set this up. The thing that was not good was being alone. And here's Cain out alone.
Now, he's out a wanderer again. Yeah, it's not good. And so God also provides something for Cain. What he provides him is an ot in Hebrew, which is the word for sign or symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the last conversation that we just had. But Cain apparently doesn't find that symbol trustworthy enough.
Mm. And the symbol was a sign that God will protect him.
Actually, that God would avenge
anybody
who kills him.
Right.
The way you put it actually made me think of it in a new way, which is kind of like so how about just preventing me from being killed?
Yeah.
Like that's what I would prefer.
Right.
And so
I guess I have to do that for myself.
Yeah. So Cain goes out from that, and in this very not good situation of being alone, he goes out, and two things happen. He finds a wife for himself, which is what God provided for the not good situation in Eden. Now here's Cain in a not good situation outside of Eden, and he obtains a wife. We're not told who or how. He just does. And then we're told that they had a baby together, and then he builds a city. And building of a city, that little phrase, build, the last time it got used is when God builds the woman.
Right.
And what God built was the Ezer, delivering ally, and what Cain builds is an Ir, a city, which is, the words look almost identical graphically to the word Ezer.
And for him, it's a delivering, like fortress ally.
But the contrast is that in this not good situation, God gave him something.
A sign,
a symbol. And what he decides to do is build his own means of deliverance, which is the city.
So you're saying if we just trust God, we don't need cities.
That, and remember, the primary association with cities is a walled enclosure to prevent people from attacking and killing you and taking your stuff.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't need that inside of Eden.
And we talked about fences and like gates and stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah. So cities are a symptom of that things are not good outside of Eden.
Right.
Because we can't trust each other. You might have a different idea of good and bad than I do. Your knowledge of good and bad might be different than mine. And your version of good might involve like beating me up and taking my stuff. Yeah. So I'm going to build an ear and protect myself because I can't depend on God to do that. And so this idea of the protection of the city and who the city of man versus the garden of God as this unwalled place that's safe and secure. These become contrasting
It's unwalled,
images.
but there's like a bouncer.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, there's the fiery sword.
Yeah, it's got its own type of, wall,
totally.
I suppose.
Yeah, totally. But the point is that it's a wall of God's own security. God's presence and his messengers are the security, whereas here it's a human providing security for themselves.
Okay.
So what we're going to track in this conversation is two parallel stories that flow out of Cain and his city. The narrator of Genesis follows the genealogy of Cain down through the generations, and what we see is an intensifying of human murder and spilling of innocent blood in the land. And that leads God to deal with it.
Genesis 6 describes the second supernatural rebellion. Some of the sons of God, members of the heavenly council, transgress the boundary between heaven and earth.
This one is about demon sex.
Oh, boy.
So what we say in the video is one of the strangest stories in the Bible is in Genesis 6.
Yes, it is.
First few verses
Strange
there.
to us.
Strange to us.
Strange to modern Westerners.
Yes. If you want to take it literally, they are the spawn of fallen spiritual beings. Yeah. You take it figuratively, and they are they're possessed by it.
Yeah. Right.
Now, let's talk about it literally for a second. How do demons have sex with women? I mean, they're a completely different type of being. They don't. Do they have sexual organs? The whole thing. So
how does that work?
How does that work?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, let's step back. The biblical storyline, the biblical view of the world assumes that heaven and earth are distinct spheres, but that are meant to overlap and occasionally do.
Yeah.
And so the spiritual beings, it's hard because our English word spiritual means now non-physical.
Yeah.
That's not true in the biblical view of the world. Spiritual beings take on physical form at many points of the biblical story.
Okay.
So let's just talk about the good ones. Right?
Yeah.
So,
like the cherubim in the garden.
Cherubim in the garden, yeah.
They were guarding the garden. They weren't just some like hologram there.
Yeah, totally.
They were actual beasts.
They kill you. Right?
Yeah, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, what if they're guards? If they're like bouncers at the door to Eden, like the
Eden
whole point
bouncers.
is that they won't let you in. So think about other good ones. When these three, what are called the three men, visit Abraham in Genesis chapter 18.
Yeah.
We're told in Genesis 19 that two of them are angels.
Yeah.
And they sat down, and Abraham made them a meal, and they ate together under a tree.
Yeah.
There you go. In Genesis 19, when those two angels go to the city of Sodom and meet up with Lot, they're quite physical. Lot tells them to come in, to his house, and then the men of Sodom come and want to rape the angels.
That's another strange story.
And actually, we can talk about that more, because the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19 is designed as a perverted inversion of the sons of God and the women in Genesis 6. Because it's humans and spiritual beings involving sex in a destructive way. And it happens in the New Testament too. When angels appear, they take on physical appearance and can do stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not the case that angels don't have bodies.
I see.
They have different kinds of bodies. And Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15, right? When he says, what body is the resurrection body?
Yeah.
And he says, well, listen, there's lots of different kinds of bodies. And he starts talking, there's the stars and birds and creatures and humans. So in the biblical imagination, spiritual beings have bodies. They are different kinds of bodies.
So they're not like ghosts in the way we think of spirits and ghouls and sprites. And
and listen, I'm not saying I find any of this easy
to
process. I find this very difficult to process.
Sure.
But I'm just trying to be honest with what the biblical authors are saying and what they mean. And in the Bible, spiritual beings regularly appear in physical form.
Yeah. And they appear like humans.
They look like humans.
They look like humans.
Correct. So the sons of God in Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2, the sons of God is the Old Testament phrase to talk about spiritual beings. It's parallel to the host of heaven, to the phrase angels, and so on. The plain sense reading of the phrase sons of God. Okay, so that's one layer. Sorry. My brain's going to do too many things. The plain sense reading is spiritual beings sexually abuse women. They take women.
And then create the Nephilim.
And we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
So another thing is that Genesis 6 is designed according to a design pattern to imitate Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, you have a woman and a spiritual being having a conversation. The woman sees that something is good, and she takes it for herself. That's the vocabulary of Genesis 3, verse 6.
Yeah.
Genesis 6 comes along as an inversion. Now it's not a woman taking as she talks to a spiritual being. It's the spiritual beings see that women are good, and they take for themselves. So they're little mirrors of each other.
You're supposed to see that these are dual rebellions of sorts.
It's intensifying the nature and scope of the combined human and spiritual rebellion. If Genesis 3 is the first wave of spiritual human rebellion, Genesis 6 is the next wave.
So one thing I'm thinking about then is that in these stories in Genesis 1 through 11, the rebellions are always have a spiritual component.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just something I don't generally
that's right.
really dwell
Actually,
on.
think it through. The three ways of rebellion are the garden with the snake and the woman.
Yeah.
Genesis 6, which is the lead up to the flood story.
Yeah.
And that's right after you finish the story about Cain and Lamech building this city built on human bloodshed.
Yeah.
So you get outside the garden, you get another human and spiritual rebellion. And then you get to Babylon.
Yeah.
And what's foregrounded is the human rebellion, and you have to wait till later in the narrative till you see that was also a spiritual rebellion.
That Babylon itself was
the building
also.
of Babylon. So all three steps of Genesis 1 to 11, chapters 4 and 6, chapter 11, are combined human and spiritual rebellions.
Yeah.
So that's the broader context.
Okay.
So it's not strange in the biblical story what's happening. It's tragic.
Yeah.
But it's within the imagination. The last confirmation is Jesus' brother, Jude, who wrote an epistle, a short letter in the New Testament. And he actually pairs these stories together, the story of the sons of God and Sodom and Gomorrah, interestingly.
He does.
He does. He sees them as design patterns with each other. He talks about angels who didn't keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode.
This is Genesis 6.
He keeps in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment day. So, and then he goes on, that's just like Sodom and Gomorrah, where they indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, which is referring to humans wanting to rape angels.
Yeah.
So he sees Genesis 6 and 19 as perverted inversions of each other. And notice in that story in Sodom, Lot goes outside to talk with these terrible men. And then he says, yeah, don't rape the guys. He says, here, I have 2 wonderful daughters. Have them.
Yeah.
So you have, once again, think this, it's all based on Genesis.
Weird.
It's terrible.
It's terrible.
It's terrible. But
Bible
it's
is
the
not a children's
inversion.
book.
Instead of the daughters of men being the object of the men of Sodom,
Yeah.
their desire, it's all inverted. But just like those beautiful women in Genesis 6, Lot wants to give his beautiful daughters. So, I'm not saying this is easy to process, but this is how Jude read the story. This is how every ancient Jewish interpreter from the time period of Jesus interpreted these stories about spiritual beings having sex with women in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is normal. So,
and I think it's supposed to be uncomfortable, right?
It's crazy. Yeah, it's not like, oh, ancient people so primitive.
Yeah,
like, and it's crazy. So the Nephilim and so on. There actually is some translation challenges with how you interpret Genesis 6 verse 4, because it actually says the Nephilim were in the land in those days.
Yeah.
And then what are those days? Those are the days when the sons of God did their thing and gave birth to the warrior giants. And so some people think that the Nephilim are different than the warriors, that they just happen to exist at the same time. There are that's one possible way to translate the text. Another way to translate it is that it's trying to associate the Nephilim with the offspring of the sons of God. And women.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And I mean, uniform, all of the earliest interpretations in Jesus' day, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the book of First Enoch, in the book of Jubilees, the wisdom of Ben Sira, and Jesus' brother, all read those stories as this screwed up merging of the sons of God and women produced the mutant warrior kings of old. So it's actually the most plain sense reading, and it's the way most people took it in the early centuries. It was only, I think, later, as Christian leaders got offended by the sheer craziness of how it sounds, that other interpretations started. And in chapter 1, Deuteronomy, verse 20, Moses says, I said to you, hey, we've come to the hill country of the Amorites. So Amorites is kind of a meta category for a people group that's already living in the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham. So the Amorites. So look, Yahweh your God has placed the land before you. Go take possession of it. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. So you all approached me and said, ooh, let's send spies. And here we go. This is the story of the spies that Moses is recalling. Okay. So he talks about how, we took 12 spies, sent them into the land. They went in. They took from the fruit of the land. They brought it back, and we saw it. And they said, it's good, the land that Yahweh has given to us. But, verse 26, you were not willing to go up. You rebelled against the command of Yahweh your God, and you grumbled in your tents, saying, he brought us out of Egypt to give us into the hands of the Amorites, and they're going to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers, that is the spies, have melted our hearts by saying, and this is the report that spies brought back, the people are bigger and taller than we are, Their cities are large and fortified. They reach up to the skies. And in addition, we saw the sons of the Anakim there.
The Anakim.
The Anakim. Okay, so we've got Amorites.
Yeah.
And the Amorites, they're connected to people who are huge, and they live in huge cities. The cities are so huge, the cities reach up to the skies.
Yeah, which is a hyperlink to Tower of Babylon.
Yeah. So just hold that, because that's important.
Okay.
It'll connect to a whole bunch of other hyperlinks back to Genesis 1 through 11. So cities that reach up to the skies connected to people that are huge. And they're called Amorites and Anakim. So this whole section of Deuteronomy is like a hyperlink trail of breadcrumbs. And you just got to keep following it all the way back. The Anakim is a reference to the sons of Anak. And in the actual narrative, so Moses is retelling a story here.
Yeah.
The actual narrative is told in the previous scroll of the Torah in Numbers, chapters 13. And in that story, the spies go in, and it says they saw the 3 sons of Anak there. Their names are Achiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the seed of Anak. And then they say they see more. They're just called the seed of Anak. And then the narrator, this is interesting.
In Numbers
13.
The narrator has the people say.
The narrator has the people say, in Numbers 13:33, we also saw there the Nephilim. And then the narrator pauses the story and says, dear reader, if you're confused, the sons of Anak, the huge giant sons of Anak, yeah, they're from the Nephilim. And then the people keep speaking again. And we were like grasshoppers in their eyes, and they were huge. So now we've got the Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6, the warrior, like spiritual being, human hybrid warriors who unleash violence in the land. This is all being connected together.
Yeah.
And this is actually really significant for understanding what it is that Yahweh is asking Israel to do as they enter into the land. So first, I want to focus on there's these inhabitants of the land who are already there.
Yeah.
And they are called Amorites. They're huge. They're called the Anakim, and the Anakim descend from the Nephilim. That's the trail of breadcrumbs up to this moment.
And to upload the Nephilim from Genesis 5, that's the story of the sons of God, or the sons of God, the
sons of Elohim.
The sons of Elohim, the spiritual beings.
Yeah.
It's like their fall narrative of seeing that human women are good, wanting to take them, and then creating this offspring. Like you called it, human, divine, Elohim hybrid.
That seems to be what the narrative implies in Genesis.
Doesn't say that explicitly.
But it implies it.
And this actually is a common ancient motif of a hybrid creature.
Yeah.
That's both human, but also more than human, who is also a giant, who are often the kings of empires.
That's right.
And they're powerful, and they're important, and they are like as close to God as you can get. And so they're like honored. But here in this narrative, it's actually this kind of new twist, which is those giant warrior kings that everyone's all on about.
Yeah.
They're a problem.
Every point in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 has a counterpoint in the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. The Enochian material, the material written after the biblical stuff but before the New Testament, intertestamental, Second Temple Jewish literature, for some reason, and there are academic explanations for this that make sense. But again, the quick version is, for some reason, whoever's writing the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and some of these other books, the Book of the Giants from Qumran, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whoever's writing this stuff knew the Apkallu story really well. And they write their version of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 with the Apkallu story in mind. So this is why Enoch has the offending watchers being sent to the realm of the dead and bound, because that's what happens to the Apkallu. We don't read that in Genesis 6. You only got 4 verses there. You get hints of it a little bit later with some of the Rephaim who live in the netherworld, and passages like Ezekiel 32. You get little bits and pieces of it. But whoever's writing the Enochian stuff is really well aware of this. And they preserve the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So we can look at that and we can kind of know, what they're sort of fishing for, because if we know the Mesopotamian Apkallu story, we can read Genesis 6, 1 through 4 and say, okay, sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim, before and after the flood. Okay, we know what they're shooting at. But it's the Enoch stuff that adds their punishment. And that's the stuff that Peter and Jude pick up on and winds up in Peter and Jude.
They're mutants. They represent an invasion of chaos and death into the land. And their ultimate end is returning to the chaos from which they emerged.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're like jumping into it right here. So both in Deuteronomy and in Genesis, these hyperlinks are really strong between the inhabitants of the land and the set of rebel figures from Genesis 1 through 11. So what I want to do, finish painting their portrait in Moses' speeches, so we fully understand like the role that they play in Moses' speech, and then go back and see the role of the giants and how they're intertwined with the Canaanites and the Anakim and the giants and cities that reach up to the skies. They are all set on close analogy to the explosion of evil and of the seed of the snake and of human violence and evil spiraling out of control in Genesis 1 through 11, requiring a great act of decreation that will reset the land so that God can replant it as a place of Eden blessing. In other words, the portrait of evil spiraling out of control in Genesis 1 to 11 that leads from the snake to Cain to Lamech to the Nephilim to Nimrod to the building of Babylon reaching up to the skies. That whole sequence right there is being replayed and recalled in Moses' speeches in Deuteronomy 1 through 11.
Of this infusion of spiritual evil and humanity together.
Yeah, that's right.
Manifesting in giant warriors.
Yeah, I guess I'm summarizing right now before we've walked through maybe more texts that show it, but I'm just giving you where I'm certain of how this works, is that the Amorites and the Anakites and the Canaanites living in the land are presented on analogy to that whole spiral of evil and violence polluting the land with the blood of the innocent from Genesis 1 through 11, requiring
a flood,
a new flood of God's judgment. And that is precisely how Israel's conquest of the land is presented, is as a human flood of divine judgment on the snaky giant inhabitants of
Genesis 6, 1 through 4 has a Mesopotamian context. It's the story of the Apkallu. And if you want to know what that story is, you can get Unseen Realm and read that. But basically, in a nutshell, here it is. There were gods before the flood who helped humans to produce civilization. And some higher up gods in Mesopotamia didn't like people. They decided to wipe them out with a flood. Well, the ones who liked humans and said, oh, well, we've invested a lot of time helping these people. Now, this is a terrible thing. What do we do? Aha, we've got it. We will mate with a few of them, and then what we know, the children that are produced will be super intelligent like we are, and so our knowledge will survive the flood. We've got to make sure that a few of them survive, and our children, our direct progeny will be part of that, and humanity will be saved. So this is the Mesopotamian story. So the ones who do this are the heroes. They're the good guys. Now the higher up gods look at this and say, that is not what we had planned. And they send the gods who help into the abyss forever, however long that is. Now the biblical story inverts that and says, look, this is a transgression of heaven and earth. This never should have happened. This is not a good thing. This is evil, it's wicked, because humans will use this knowledge to become better sinners, okay, to be more self-destructive. Biblical texts and other texts say this is why humans are so efficient at war. This is why they have a problem, with lust. This is where they learn to be astrologers. All sorts of stuff that really turned out to be self-destructive in other biblical stories. The blame goes right here. And so what Genesis 6:1-4 is it's a story about both human and divine rebellion against the boundaries that God has established, and the destruction that results from not staying where you belong and trying to become godlike and thinking that you know better than God. So at every point, the biblical version of this kind of inverts the Mesopotamian version of this. So to summarize Genesis 6:1-4, the most, if I can call it this, the most traditional supernaturalist reading of the passage is you have divine beings who can presume, create, and take on bodies. Okay? And when they show up in flesh, as they often do in other passages, flesh can do what flesh does. And they deliberately try to raise up their own populations, either thinking that, well, they could do better, because the world is just in a bad place in Genesis 6, verse 5. Whatever their motivations might have been, ancient texts outside the Bible vary on this, but they're the ones who produce the Nephilim, who are these giants. Now, in the biblical story, it's this act, it's this incident that is the explanation for the giant clans that try to wipe out Israel later. In the book of Numbers 13:33, Moses and Joshua run into the Anakim. And it says explicitly in that verse, the Anakim are from the Nephilim. The Anakim were also known as Rephaim and Amim and Zamzum. There's a whole bunch of names for them. In other texts, we find that when you killed one of these, their disembodied spirit is a resident of hell. Okay, so you have a demonic connection to them that is traceable all the way back to this incident.
This raises all kinds of alarms for me, and I have all kinds of problems with that, just personally,
right?
Challenges that raises for me. But what I'm trying to do is, that it's the discipline in biblical scholarship and biblical studies is before I react to the Bible, I at least want to first understand what it's saying on its own terms.
Yeah.
And so that's been a big part of my effort in trying to understand this theme. And this has helped me at least understand what the narratives are doing on their own terms. So I guess I just told you my conclusion. Normally what I do is just like lead you on a trail through a bunch of biblical texts for an hour, and then I try and summarize, but I guess I just gave you my summary right there. So tell me what you hear in that summary, and then maybe we can hop into some particular biblical texts.
Yeah. In Genesis 1-11, we've established an idea, which is that there are two rulers in God's creation.
Yeah.
The rulers above, the host of heaven, the Elohim, and they have their place. And then there's the rulers below, the humans. And the humans are then given this task to be God's image, to rule the cosmos.
In the garden land.
In the garden land.
That is given to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you get this narrative of a snake who is a beast of the garden land, who is not happy with this setup.
Yeah.
And seems to kind of know about the way God works and thinks.
Yeah.
And he deceives the humans to not want to partner with God.
Yeah. And particularly to take what will lead them to death and present it as the way to life and liberation and power.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can become Elohim, the snake says.
Take from the tree of knowing good and bad, the tree of understanding.
Yeah.
And take it on your own terms.
Yeah.
You don't need God.
God's command is not the way to you becoming who you truly made to be.
Yeah. You can have it without God.
You can do it by taking it for yourself. Yep.
And then they're exiled. And then we get this story where Cain and Abel, two brothers, want to come back into the garden.
Actually, here, let's pause. So when Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden,
sure.
God tells woman there's going to be two seeds coming out of this, two lineages.
Right.
The seed of the woman and the seed of the snake.
Yeah.
And you're like, huh? Okay.
Yeah, like this is just I thought this was just like a crafty snake.
Yeah. And there's going to be perpetual hostility between these two seeds, these two lineages.
These two powers.
Yeah, these two powers. And ultimately, a seed will come from the woman that will crush the head of the snake. But that snake is going to be grabbing after the heel of that seed of the woman and strike it as well. So when you walk into the next narrative about two seeds of the woman, Cain and Abel, Cain is presented with a choice because of what God does, which is favor his brother's offering. And Cain is tempted to be angry and jealous. And what God says is that temptation is sin, which is like a crouching animal at the door, and it wants you. So the same animal that tempted his parents is reappearing now before Cain, but in a form called sin.
Yeah.
And this is the narrative's way of saying this is Cain's moment at the tree with his choice, like his parents. And so the moment he murders his brother, he's a seed of the woman, but he comes under the influence of the snake, as it were. And it's the narrative's way of saying that anybody can become a snakeling through their choices. And so Cain begins a lineage of the snake. He becomes seed of the snake. And then you have two lines after that. You have the next son of Adam and Eve, Seth, and then you have the line of Cain, and both have genealogies, and the line of Cain just gets out of control with violence and chopping heads off and so on. So I just wanted to fill in that little bit for you. Got too far down the line.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, you've got this interplay between the spiritual beings and how they've kind of injected their ways and their power into the humans.
Yeah, or at least a spiritual being who works through the lie and the lure of doing what's good in your own eyes.
Yeah. So you've got that established. So by the time you get to Genesis 5.
And that line leads to the building of the first city.
Oh, Cain's line does.
Cain's line leads to the building of the first city.
Yeah. And then there's lots of violence. And then you get to a king who's like just boasting in his violence.
About his, violent accomplishments.
Yeah.
That's
and
right.
so you've seen how like then the power of the snake sin has corrupted humanity to a degree where he's just boasting and just like killing his fellow humans.
That's right. And God says the blood of the innocent cries out from the ground.
Which becomes then the through line to why there needs to be a flood.
Correct.
To wash
That's right.
the
That's
land.
Right. So then, after that, you get the story about the sons of Elohim.
Yeah, before the flood.
Yeah, that's right.
You get a story, and it's framed. Isn't the story framed now in the time of violence, or how's it framed?
Well, it just begins. It just says, when Adam began to multiply on the land, daughters were born to the humans.
Oh, okay.
And the sons of Elohim saw the daughters of human, that they were good, and they took for themselves.
And this is linking now this idea of Adam and Eve seeing that the fruit was good and taking, and that led to their exile and fall. Here's now more spiritual beings than just the snake, sin. More spiritual beings seeing that humans are good. And it's kind of riffing on this idea of this contention between the two.
Yeah, that's right.
The rulers.
Exactly right.
And their fall is to mix, to try to like what God separated as these two powers and was good.
Yeah.
Powers above, powers below. They're coming to mix together. They see that the women are good.
They take
them. And they bear children.
Yeah. Illicit joining of sky rulers and land rulers, but for some devious purpose. So what Yahweh says is, we have whole podcast episodes on this.
Yeah.
So I just want to refer back to them. But what God does is he essentially says like, nope, not down for this. The human is a flesh creature. And the clock starts ticking today, 120 years. Could refer to limited lifespan. I think more likely it refers to setting the clock before the great decreation that's going to
happen.
It's God's response to all this. And then what we're told is, it's really interesting. In the day that whole thing went down, Genesis 6, verse 4, you know who just happened to be in the land in those days? The giants. The Nephilim were there in those days and also afterward, because they're going to reappear in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Dear reader, so just know.
Be aware.
Be aware. So Genesis 6, verse 4 is written from the perspective of someone who knows that
post-flood,
that these creatures are going to also be in the land when the Israelites get there in the days of Moses. So the Nephilim were there. These were the Gibborim, mighty, violent warriors of old, men of the name, men who gained reputation through military prowess and violent glory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, these are often the revered, like, warrior kings.
Yeah. Basically, this little bit right here, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, is like the Saturday Night Live satire on
the political agenda,
the political propaganda down in Egypt, over in Assyria, and over in Babylon.
Yeah, famously, is it Gilgamesh? Or
Yeah, the Gilgamesh epic, which is a whole fascinating thing unto itself, but presents its main hero as Gilgamesh, the king of these ancient Mesopotamian empires, as I think it's 2/3 human and 1/3 divine. But he's the offspring of a spiritual being and a human. And he's the founder of, the great empires that were founded in the same place that will lead to Babylon.
Yeah.
And so that's the motif that the story is satirizing. Is that a verb?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And saying, no, this is not the birth of the heroes and honorable ones of old. This is another invasion of evil and chaos in trying to introduce death into the human family, which God has destined for life.
Yeah. So this is a biblical way of thinking about when humanity becomes so corrupted by the power of sin and transformed by it, that we've learned that it can get to a point where God says, like, the injustice is so great, I need to wash the earth clean of it.
Yeah, Yahweh is not angry in this story. He's grieved.
He's sad.
And what he sees is that Genesis 6, verse 11, the land is corrupted.
Yeah.
Implied through the whole chain to all the innocent blood. The land was filled with violence. So God looks upon an already ruined creation. And the flood is the means of purging it of evil and recreating it so that he can plant the seed of a new remnant, seed of the woman, and restart the Eden mission.
Yeah.
And that's the story.
Right.
So God accelerates and brings to its natural end a course of self-ruin that creation was set upon by the seed of the snake.
Yeah.
Which is Cain, Lamech, and the Nephilim and the violent warriors of old.
Yeah. And when you think of the flood as like wiping out, human life, it's a very uncomfortable story. In fact, I was watching these kind of social commentator comic people. They go on the street with protesters and different things and try to make them look silly, but in a very kind of ironic way. And one of the things that I saw them do was go to people at pro-life rallies who are also Christians and talk about, is the Bible pro-life? And they would say, yeah, the Bible's pro-life.
Oh, sure.
And then they would go, yeah, well, except for that story where God kills everybody in the worldwide flood.
Yeah.
And they do it a couple different times, and then they're just kind of speechless. They're just kind of
interesting.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty gnarly.
Yeah, it is gnarly.
And it is gnarly.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting when you look at this, the way that the story is presented, it's because humans have become so violent and infected with like violence.
Yeah.
And killing each other.
Yeah.
That, God he takes away life. It's an interesting, it's something really hard to deal with, but then also there's a layer deeper of getting into like
Mm-hmm.
There is some justice and also wanting to protect the opportunity for life.
Yeah. So one thought on that end, and this is clearly something that occurred to Israelites themselves, which is a part of why these texts are framing it this way. So just one way that, here's another chapter in the Torah, different scroll, but back in Leviticus, chapter 18, which opens by saying, hey, listen, people lived in Egypt in a certain way, and you lived there, and I don't want you to live that way anymore. And the way of Egypt is epitomized by the oppression and slavery and exploitation of immigrants.
Yeah. The power of Ra.
Yeah, in the name of their gods and in the power of their king. So Moses says, so the way that Egypt operated and lived, and you live there, yeah, don't live that way. And then Moses says, nor are you to do what they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. They also live in a culture that leads to death. And so Leviticus 18 begins a whole way of depicting this alternative community that Yahweh wants to create. And then there's a concluding frame around that where Yahweh says, hey, listen, don't defile yourselves. Don't let death infect you by any of these ways of life. For by means of these ways of life, the nations that I'm casting out before you have become infected with death. And the land has become infected with death. So it's the word defiled, to make impure.
Yeah.
But to be impure is to catch the death virus, as it were. So he says the nations that live in the land of Canaan have that infection, and the land itself has been infected with death. Therefore, I have brought its punishment upon it, and the land has vomited out its inhabitants. And as for you all, you keep my statutes that lead to life. And then Moses concludes, and if you don't, the land will vomit you all out, just as it vomited out the nations before you. So in other words, God has destined creation for life. And when peoples, as individuals, then families, and then villages and cities and empires set themselves on a course towards death, thinking that it's good, right? They defile themselves and the land with death. They'll reach these flood-like moments. And here it's vomiting.
Yeah.
And that's the portrait. And so once we get here to Deuteronomy, that's the logic here. What's interesting is that it's the land itself that's reacting.
Yeah.
And that's connected to the flood. So I think bring it all the way back to your point, what makes this hard, what makes the Israelites entering into the land particularly hard, is it's not creation reacting to the humans.
Yeah.
Like in the flood, or in this image of the land vomiting
Right.
you out. God has appointed his human images, who were meant to be a blessing to all the nations of the world, but to these 7 that have given themselves over to the ways of the snake, God's human images become agents of death, destruction, flood, decreation.
And it's easier to picture that with Adam and Eve subduing a snake. Let's get the snake out of the garden.
Totally. Yeah.
But when the snake has been infused with fellow humans, then it just gets really uncomfortable. Like, how do you get the snake out?
That's right.
Of the humans?
That's right.
You got to kill the humans?
That's right. And we cannot forget that the Genesis scroll taught us that even God's chosen ones can become the seed of the snake, and often do. That was the story of Jacob, who's born grabbing the heel and lying like a snake.
Right.
And God takes him on a painful journey to transform him into an image of God.
And we saw many stories in Numbers and in Exodus of God having to bring judgment on his own people.
Totally. Yeah. And actually, the fact that Israel will itself become seed of the snake over the course of its history, leading to exile in Babylon, means that Israel itself became the Nephilim giants, Nimrod, Babylon, Egypt's itself.
Yeah, if this was purely just political propaganda to give them permission to go and take a land from the people, if it was purely that, then it kind of stopped short of being really good propaganda, because then that same line of thought brings them to them needing to also be taken out of the land through justice because they've become corrupted.
Yes.
Really good propaganda would be like, and whatever we do is going to be awesome.
Totally.
Because we're awesome. They're bad, we're awesome, full stop. There's a lot of really critical self-reflection here.
Yeah, in other words, Deuteronomy, its presentation of the Canaanites as a people given over to the snake, is one part of a story that you have to keep reading. And as you keep reading the story, the people that are right now being called to stomp out the snakes in the land of Canaan are themselves going to become snakes and themselves stomped out of the land by an even bigger snake, that is Babylon. And so I love what you just said. In other words, the whole story is actually an indictment on all human communities.
Yeah.
And the portrait of God here is both troubling, but it's also realistic because it's showing that if God is going to do anything in this world, in and through humans, it's God partnering with snakes, right?
Yeah.
Or at least people
infected by the power of the snake.
There you go. By people infected with the power of the snake. Actually, that's important. That's actually crucially important. God doesn't partner with snakes.
Yeah.
He partners with humans who are constantly giving themselves over to the power of the snake.
Yeah.
And which means that for God to truly partner with humans in the real world will involve God in messy situations where there are no good options. And I think that's the framework within which I'm trying to sit with my own discomfort at God's choices. But I think it's just important to say that the biblical authors
they don't tie a bow on it for you.
Don't tie a bow on this. And that what that forces us to do is sit with these narratives and meditate on them to learn about human nature and also to learn about the mysterious purpose of God in the world that leads to Jesus. But another part of what makes these stories so uncomfortable is that after the first few centuries, when the Jesus movement was a religious, cultural, cognitive minority in the Roman Empire, with the shift towards Constantine begins a shift towards the Jesus movement becoming enfranchised or enmeshed with the state power systems, first of the Roman Empire, and then it's replayed in different continents and cultures all over the world. And once that shift happens, then all of a sudden, these stories are being read and interpreted, not by their original authors. The people who wrote all these texts were
They're not the empire.
No, they were a part of persecuted religious, cultural minorities.
Right.
The people who composed this literature.
Yeah.
But the moment you have communities that are allied or are participants in state power, then all of a sudden these narratives become templates for conquest, colonial expansion. And these narratives have been appealed to and become the pattern for, colonial conquest on every continent by multiple cultures and language groups. So in our social location right here, we're sitting in centuries in the aftermath of that.
And one of the keys that kind of maybe helps you not do that, other than just recognizing the audience that this was, is that this all is leading to Jesus.
Yes.
And when Jesus, he defeats the snake.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he becomes the model for how to defeat the snake and his conquest of the snake.
Yeah.
And then the way he teaches his disciples to continue to fight is not of this kind of conquest.
Yeah.
It's actually of very sacrificial, loving your enemy. As a follower of Jesus, I want Israel to go into the promised land and do friend evangelism.
Totally.
And win over their hearts.
Yeah.
And build a beautiful new culture with the Amorites, Canaanites, Jebusites.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you. And that was Jesus's.
And that's Jesus'
vision. That's how Jesus picked up this whole set of themes and took it as marching orders for the arrival of the kingdom of God that he was bringing.
The flood of justice that Israel is bringing on to these people, which is also the flood that was brought on to humanity because of its violence. Jesus takes on himself.
Yeah, and even more, so the gospel authors present Jesus as bringing God's judgment on the principalities and powers. This is why when Jesus shows up in a graveyard, and there's this superhuman strength guy there in the graveyard, and he asks them, like, what's the name of the powers that influence you? And they say,
we are Legion.
Legion. It's the Gibborim. It's Nephilim.
What do you mean?
Oh, he's fighting a whole legion. It's military language to describe the powers of evil that Jesus is confronting.
You think it's riffing off of the...
Yeah,
it's the powers within this guy who's making this guy such a menace.
The sons of Elohim.
It's the evil. It's the sons of Elohim.
Yeah.
Well,
why else is the narrator presenting Jesus as enemy in that scene, not the human, but a legion of soldier spirit beings?
Right? Infecting this guy.
Yeah, and this is all about, the mighty warriors and the Nimrods and so on. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus, this is in Luke's account uniquely in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's being arrested on the night of, the night of his arrest, and the guards come. And these are the Jewish priestly representatives and Jewish temple guards. And what he says is, this hour belongs to you, talking to the humans there, and to the powers of darkness. So Jesus sees these humans as actually captive to a whole structural power mindset called Israel in league with Rome as the architects of his murder. And that's certainly what Paul thought. This is why in 1 Corinthians 3, he talks about the powers that crucified our Lord. And people debate, is he talking about Pilate and Caiaphas, or is he talking about spiritual powers? And the whole thing is, in Genesis 1 through 11, they're not different. Like when a human community structures itself in a way that defines evil as good, they're embracing lies and engaging in an illicit union of evil and good to the degree that it produces death. And so just the biblical authors have such a different way of viewing reality than we do.
Yeah.
So my point is, Jesus and the apostles actually viewed themselves as picking up the language and imagery of this cycle, this pattern in the Hebrew Bible. And they never once connected it to the actual physical coercion or conquest of humans.
Yeah.
It was about an aggressive stance taken to the lies and the spiritual forces at work in the architecture of human lives and human societies. So in other words, when Paul says our enemy at the end of Ephesians, our enemy is never flesh and blood. It's the powers and principalities animating the whole thing. I don't think he's innovating. Like that's an idea. I think that we're supposed to, the story of Israel's conquest of Canaan is, you have to read it in the larger sweep from Genesis to Kings, where Israel itself will become, influenced by the snake. And so the oppressed become oppressors, as it were. And that the real enemy at work under all of Genesis through Kings is the snake and his minions.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is Paul and Jesus, I think, actually understood the message of the Hebrew Bible. And that Paul's statement, our enemy is not flesh and blood, is a message we should be getting out of the meaning of Deuteronomy and of Joshua in its current form. Actually, if you read these stories in the context of the Hebrew Bible, that's the meaning that you are led to.
How?
Because how is it that a society gives itself over to embracing the way of the snake? It's by believing the lie.
Yeah.
Believing the lie, that God isn't generous, that God isn't good.
And the lie begins with desiring something.
That's right. Distorted desire towards a misdirected end that brings death or contributes or participates in a culture of death.
Because that's how Paul usually refers to as flesh, right? Is kind of the the impulses.
Yeah, the way the human body generates desires, and the way I meet those desires can either point me to the source of all fulfillment of desire, or it can point me to the way of meeting that desire that's temporary and harmful to myself and other people.
And to the degree that you do that, that's Paul saying flesh.
Yep. Yeah.
And the degree that you align your desires with God that he refers to as spirit.
Correct. Yeah. And it happens that in these narratives of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Canaanites become an icon of the ways of the snake and the works of the flesh. And this is, when you read the Gospels, this is what Jesus was constantly talking about.
Yeah.
This is why he didn't start a revolutionary war against Rome.
Because Rome was captive to something greater.
Yeah, he went out to the desert for 40 days to conquer the real enemy that was tempting him to take the kingdom of God over the world, but through violent force.
Yeah.
And he resisted that, and he went about confronting a spiritual enemy that had captured a lot of people's bodies and minds and hearts. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of Luke, and he's getting arrested, he calls it, "This is the time for the power of the dark." That's what he says. And he allows the power of the darkness to overcome him.
Wow, how incredible is this? I hope you guys are enjoying this, and I hope you're learning a lot. I want to ask you for a second to subscribe. If you're enjoying the content, share it, press that like button, slap it. Help this channel grow, help the message of the good news of what Jesus has done for this world get out. You're a part of this community with me. I always say we, and really it's just me behind the camera. But I've got you guys as support, encouragement, and you're here for the ride, and I'm so grateful for you. So thank you for subscribing, thank you for liking, thank you for sharing the content, and thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Let's get back to ringing them bells.